Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management.
GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD, monitoring, and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds.
Today, we're speaking with Christina Hupy and Nuritzi Sanchez. Christina is GitLab's Senior Education Program Manager, and Nuritzi is GitLab's Senior Open Source Program Manager. We're talking about something very near and dear to my heart, strategic volunteering for open source communities, not just because it's a thing you're supposed to do, but because it helps you build your resume or CV even before you even have your first tech job, maybe while you're studying at a boot camp, while you're on furlough. That at least is something happening here in the UK that kind of extends till maybe you might lose your job, or in the case of millions of tech workers around the world right now, when you're actually looking for your next job, or maybe in tech we always are. So I think contributing to open source is a great way to support a lot of causes. And also we're going to talk about today supporting rehabilitation and job training while incarcerated, which is a new and fascinating use case for open source, especially since this episode is very relevant to job preparation. We always start with this question, but I think it's more appropriate than ever. Tell us about your tech journeys. How has the open source community helped your careers, if at all?
All right. I guess I can start. I actually studied international relations and psychology in university. And so I grew up in the Silicon Valley, but my parents are both from Mexico, and I was always interested in some sort of social impact work that I could do. I had a lot of trouble narrowing down my area of focus because I saw so many needs and so many things that interested me. And so when I started to explore technology, I sort of fell into product management early on, but I still wanted to explore other things within tech. I didn't really know the different titles or the different career possibilities even at that point. LinkedIn was just starting up, so it wasn't as easy to get an understanding. And so through my tech journey, it was really about how I fit into technology, being somebody who is not an engineer and not a designer, or somebody who is obviously related to the product. As I mentioned, I had a little bit of product management experience early on, but I was more interested in acquiring other skills and just generally knowing, again, how to best fit in. So for me, when I joined an open source, I helped start an open source company called Endless. That was really the beginning of my experience in it. It was a company that created Linux desktops for people with little to no internet access. We focused a lot in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, had a global presence. But I saw the opportunities to really leverage open source to solve problems in your communities. And so was really interested from that social impact perspective. When I joined GNOME, Endless was a GNOME-based Linux desktop. I really cared more about expanding the opportunities and bringing in diverse skill sets, all of that. In that process, I got experience really, within the engagement side of things. I became part of the board of directors for GNOME, and so then had some experience with governance. And so for me, open source really allowed me to explore a wide variety of different things within tech to really gain a closer working relationship with engineers and really the product team again. and to focus on the governance aspect of, working on the strategy of the organization, which is what I was really interested in doing as well. So yes, for me, it really helped with my own career.
Well, I love it because I was a political science major and also have zero experience in tech, but I've worked in tech for 10, 11 years. So that is the wonder of tech, isn't it? So Christina, tell us about your journey. Is it similar or different than?
Sure, absolutely. So I found tech as an undergraduate. I first started out not knowing what I wanted to do, but then I ended up taking a class that involved maps actually and geography. And I just fell in love with geographic information systems and ended up dedicating my whole career to it. So I ended up going on to graduate school and getting a PhD in GIS, and then going on to be a professor for over a decade. And I started working with industry while being a professor, and it was kind of twofold. Part of it was trying to connect people who were students in the university with the tech industry itself. So really trying to create meaningful partnerships between the people who were learning and then the people who were actually doing the things out in the field. And so I was internship program manager, and I was the PI in a large grant to create the first high-tech degree in our state, which was Wisconsin at the time, to teach people how to go out and do geospatial technology. And as part of that relationship with industry, we kept running into problems where with proprietary licenses, you couldn't have the students using a proprietary license working for a company while they were in school, and there were a lot of barriers. So we started using open source. So the students could really work directly with industry because the license allowed that. And at the same time, I started getting interested in consulting and realized that I had a contribution to make to industry, and I certainly couldn't afford, starting out a really expensive license. So I started using open source for my own consulting, and that grew into a startup. And that led to a whole different career trajectory, which is teaching and training and education and open source.
Yeah, I saw, because obviously I stalked your LinkedIn profile. That's journalism research nowadays. Yes. So I saw in it that it was a wild statistic that I hadn't even heard of the GitLab education program before, but we're talking more than 1.6 million users at universities, which I think is really cool because a lot of universities are teaching the tech. They're not teaching the culture side of tech. There's not a lot of tech ethics yet. There's not a lot of DevOps, which is a dramatic in-demand skill set. There's not a lot of learning how to work on a team or remotely. So I think that's really interesting. Can you tell us about that program and how education and tech really mix, or not always do? I'm not sure.
Sure, absolutely. Great question. So the GitLab for Education program was started in 2018. And it was started as a minimum viable program. If you read anything about GitLab and our values, you'll see that we have iteration as one of our key values. And the idea is basically any minimum viable change that you can make, you should make that change, and then we'll just keep iterating on it. And that's really what the GitLab for Education program was. Our CEO said we should really give licenses to people who are teaching and learning DevOps. So that we can really spread and evangelize DevOps itself, and of course Git and GitLab as part of that. And so the program grew very quickly to over 1 million users, and as you mentioned, we're almost at 1.62 here, and over 800 institutions in over 65 countries. So that's really exciting. And during those first couple years, we're really giving away licenses. And then I came on board in November, and our goal is to really to grow the program beyond just giving away licenses and to build an engaged community of people who are teaching and learning DevOps and open source and Git as part of that as well. And also, as you mentioned, there's a lot of room to grow in thought leadership in DevOps. So that's also something I'm really interested in, because it really hasn't made its way into formal education yet. And just to kind of give you some idea of what we're doing, we include access to our GitLab forum as part of the education program. We write a lot of blog posts. We have case studies where we're highlighting how different institutions around the world, and again, over 65 countries, so there's a lot of different ways that people are using it, from research to grading with DevOps, with the actual CI/CD, to storing their research papers and research data and open science. There's so many exciting things going on. And really my goal is to keep building that and keep adding more programs so that we can really engage with the community. And our next initiative is to start highlighting the work of students. So we're going to do interviews and videos with students who really want to showcase the exciting stuff they're doing.
That's amazing, because that's branding for those students, and obviously branding for y'all,
Exactly.
because they're Gen Z mostly, so they're going to share it. But can they then, I always tell people when I'm doing LinkedIn profile, like I do pro bono LinkedIn profile consulting, and I always tell them, well, if you're thinking about it in tech, maybe you should do open source, because if you're a big enough contributor, you can put it as your employer. I would. I don't care as a presumptive, not actual employer, but whether you're getting paid for a job or not, I care about the work you're doing. So can they then use that on their LinkedIn profile? Can they then use that proof of work? Is it public GitLab code that they're publishing and things?
Yes, absolutely. We strongly encourage that, and that's one of the features of our platform, is that you can go to your profile and see over time the contributions that you've made on a daily basis, and it actually hot links to those contributions. So as for us as team members, we love to see how we've made progress since we started and what days of the week we're most productive. But for students, it really shows not only those tech skills, right? So the coding, or if they're contributing to documentation, which hopefully we get to talk about today as well, but then how you collaborate. That's one of the really amazing things about GitLab, is because it is an end-to-end platform. You're collaborating across teams and on projects in ways that you may not be able to demonstrate if you're just doing one singular item. And so by putting that on your LinkedIn profile, you're able to show those soft skills and those collaboration skills and people skills, as well as the specific technical skills.
And in a distributed team, because at least for the next year, that's going to be one of the most in-demand skills, is being able to collaborate remotely.
Absolutely.
It's the only thing that makes sense right now. So Nuritzi, when I was talking your LinkedIn profile, wink, wink, you self-describe as an internal advocate for making GitLab even better for open source organizations, communities, and projects. Does that mean the code? Does that mean the community? What does that even mean? What's better?
Sure. So first of all, similar to how Christina runs a GitLab for Education program, I run the GitLab for Open Source program, which allows open source organizations to get access to our top tiers for free, so that they can use enterprise grade features for free for their projects. That's part of what our program does. There are some organizations that also want to use the fully free software version or open source software version of GitLab, which is the community edition. And so we help them also sometimes with migration assistance or other ways to really help them make the transition over. Since joining, I started in February, so both Christina and I are fairly new to GitLab. But since joining in February, I started an open source partners program for organizations like GNOME, KDE, and XFCE, et cetera, lots of other organizations that have large communities that are transitioning from really lots of different tools and trying to use GitLab now. That's challenging, like having to pitch that to communities, gain enough consensus to actually do that. It's a social challenge. It's not just a tech and tools challenge. And so assisting organizations through that process is something that we're hoping to do more and more of. And we're also, as part of that, for example, the community edition that I mentioned is essentially the free and core version of our enterprise product. And so a lot of times communities need features that are in other levels. At GitLab, because we're an open core company, we have an open roadmap. Organizations can build along with us and really work with our product team to create something that's really going to be useful for their organizations. And so part of my job is to help connect those dots, to make sure that those conversations are happening, for me to plug into those communities as much as possible to understand what the real needs are and how we can continue to improve that, and therefore advocate for that change at GitLab so that we can, again, continue to create these great products, not only for software delivery, but again, because my background is non-engineering, I really see GitLab as a platform that enables cross-functional team collaboration. So making it easy for people organizing open source events, or that are designing for it, or that are fundraising for open source. How do we make GitLab a great place for people that are working on other contributions outside of just engineering contributions, and really make sure that our community edition is not, falling behind, but is something that's really great for organizations. So that's part of what I do. Hopefully a lot more in the future. I'm really excited about this space, and GitLab moves really quickly. So we're going to see lots of stuff happening soon.
Well, if they're iterating constantly, they're moving fast.
Yes.
For sure. So you said we talked about how open source can be better for people. What is a better open source to both of you, that question?
I guess clarification. So what is better open source? Is that okay? So I think when I hear that question, I think of automatically, I think about sustainability in open source. I think that's one of the topics that is really on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And for those of you unfamiliar with that term, we talk about sustainability not only in the financial sense of how do we make sure that people are able to contribute to open source in a way that allows them to pay the bills, or, in general for open source projects to be able to have financial stability and be able to keep growing. That's one aspect, the financial aspect. But sustainability also relates to burnout and making sure that when you're contributing, you don't burn out, because it could, especially if you're contributing to open source outside of your normal day job, that can be a quick path to burnout. So I think that these are some of the things that people are thinking about to make open source better, and where we hope to also contribute as a team at GitLab. I think those are some of the things that our community team is thinking about as we continue to advocate for what it means to make open source better.
Christina, do you have more to add to what a better open source world is?
Sure. Nuritzi and I have been brainstorming a little bit on this idea of diversity and inclusion, and how open source can play a role in particularly increasing diversity in the tech talent pipeline itself, right? Because a lot of companies want to increase their diversity in terms of their team members, but if the talent pipeline isn't there, then that's even a bigger barrier. And then, given my background in training and education, for me, a better open source is really lowering the barrier to contributing. So making it easier for people who are transitioning or wanting to open, wanting to move into the tech industry. How can we lower that barrier to make it easy to contribute? There's, higher education itself is very inaccessible to a lot of people. And then it's also really not focused on industry needs either. So there's a gap, and I think that there's a huge opportunity to make it easier for people to contribute and build a career and learn about what open source can do while they're getting ready to enter the workforce.
We definitely have to admit, let's be honest, open source has a diversity problem more than the tech industry, because I think the tech industry, and this is just one of many measurements, but it's typically the easiest, male, female, it's like 23% female, non-binary, while open source, the last statistic I saw was about 4% gender, minority, etc. And it's because it's a volunteer situation most of the time. And if it's not, it's at a big company where they have other diversity issues for female engineers. So it makes sense that there'd be less because it's volunteer and we are more likely to have income limitations, usually have other work outside our day jobs. We're caring for other human beings, especially right now. We're struggling because, at least ad hoc among the women in tech I know in the US and the UK, we feel like it's women that are getting more furloughed and more let go because of assumptions about what we need to do right now. There's a lot of issues, especially when you're talking about volunteer work and trying to move up. And it can be kind of controversial. While there's a lot of benefits, the open source community, it can be kind of controversial in that way. So how can open source communities better reach out to recruit and serve these typically underrepresented in the tech community and wildly underrepresented in open source?
Okay, so yeah, Christina and I both talked about this a little bit before, but I think that, we talked about how sustainability is something that we're really interested, that the open source community in general is really interested in tackling. There are some programs out there already, like Outreachy, which is an awesome internship program specifically it started off as the open source program for women at GNOME. So it was specifically to help more women enter the open source world, but it's now expanded to other underrepresented minorities in technology. And it's a paid internship where people get mentoring and again, it's something that also, it's not only for students, it's for people of all ages, and for non-coding things as well. It could be design, translation, anything. So that's one of the efforts to kind of address that problem of people can't just volunteer their free time and, do that just on a volunteer basis. We need more programs like that. And actually, I have been plugging into other communities. Like there's an all women's college here in the Bay Area that has lots of Black and Hispanic women as part of the engineering program, and just in general, it attracts a lot of minorities. And I ended up going to speak to them about open source. And one of the pieces of feedback that I received is that it was really difficult to even apply to the Outreachy program. There was interest, but there wasn't enough mentorship really even leading into that. So when they were receiving, internship opportunities at other places, a lot of times people would really walk them through the process or, help them in those ways. And for open source, the whole philosophy so far has been, just if you want to do it, you have to come in and make it happen. There's not as much mentorship as there have been for other things. So I think that's one way that we can really start making progress is developing more mentorship programs and really focusing on building relationships with people in underrepresented communities. And I think that this is something where we also have to step outside of our comfort zone. In general, we oftentimes bring in our friends and they might be like us. And so we really have to make an effort to identify communities that already exist. There's the Anita B Foundation, for example, that has an awesome community of women in technology. And they had this sisters mailing group where I was able to talk about an open source conference, and women from all around the world messaged me. This is an example from last year. A woman from Nigeria messaged me and wanted to get plugged into the conference organization. And we talked. I helped onboard her through a video conference, which is much more personal than just, chatting. I spent some time kind of onboarding her and helping her understand how things worked, giving her insight into who people were. She helped at that conference and soon became plugged into the GNOME Foundation. Today, she's won a newly elected board of director because people saw her potential and her ability to really have this new perspective. We haven't really done anything we haven't had a lot of presence, the GNOME Foundation in Africa. And so really understanding how to reach awesome technologists there is something that we're really excited about. And she's bringing in that new perspective. And it was all about relationship building, really plugging into those communities and having some sort of the relationship beyond just what is usual in open source, which is like chat and mailing lists and boards. So I think that's really important moving forward.
And I guess in this world where we're living in Zoom right now or Microsoft Teams, picking up a phone, and Slack, we tend to even more so say, oh, well, everyone's on Zoom fatigue, so we should just not bother. We should just write a note. And it's still important to make those relationships, especially with people that I hope that woman that reached that point on the board is getting paid now.
So it's still an open source volunteer space, but I think that there are career implications for that. Having this on a resume really does help you stand out from other applicants. And the exciting part is that open source is growing. I was I attended the OSS Summit last week and heard Heather Miller from Carnegie Mellon give a keynote about how much opportunity there is in open source today. We were talking about so Stack Overflow, for example, did a study on how much experience people had, and about 41% of engineers these days have less than 5 years of experience. And which means that we're having, and it's only going to grow. We have all these kids now taking STEM, classes. So we're going to have a huge influx of newcomers, and people need training for that. And open source, again, is this place where you can go and get hopefully mentored by people who are engineers at some of the top tech companies in the world. So even if you might not be getting paid, you are getting this mentorship experience, or hopefully getting mentored by professionals and helping to gain the skills that will set you aside or apart from other candidates when you're going into your career. So I think that even though you're not getting paid for it, this is where that sustainability kicks in, which we've talked about already. There are some real tangible benefits to people besides just getting paid for the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's true, though. I guess I'm always an advocate for especially minorities, underrepresented minorities, to access more financial need. But no, it's totally true. And what you said about welcoming other countries, the biggest gateway to open source communities is translation. And people don't realize that that's a good way towards a tech job too. If you speak many languages and you can prove that you've been translating technical content, maybe you won't get paid by that open source, but you can make very good money elsewhere, because it is a huge barrier to entry that everything's just in English. So that's great.
Definitely. And the other thing that I want to say is that having this is just again, the beginning, because we have more people, on the board. We might decide to start having more financial aid programs. For example, when I was on the board, I recognized that a lot of people in other countries outside of the United States and Europe really needed more financial assistance when traveling to events. And I really advocated for having them be a part of the in-person events, because it's sort of like when you're working remote and everybody else is, in a headquarters, that you feel like things are happening and you're not part of it. And in order to create a really global community, you need to have people meeting in person, not, with the core contributors. And so I helped, along with another one of the board members, spearhead a new policy to help with much more financial aid to help get people to our conferences, and then also have our core conferences go to other places in the world, so that we could automatically have the core contributors go there and meet the communities. So I I think that by having people on the board with minority background or who are minorities in technology, you again get that thought perspective, this perspective that can help you create change. So hopefully, even if we're not paying them now, that might be something that's really advocated for within those communities, and there, might be opportunities for that down the line.
How do you think the open source community could support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Sure, I can take that one. So Nuritzi and I talked a little bit about that before we got on the call today, and I think two main themes came up for us. And one is because many open source projects and the software that they create are free and open for people to use. Organizations that are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement can access that software for free to help them do what they need to do. So the idea that the infrastructure that's required is less expensive if it's free, obviously, and there's less resources financially, and that money can be used for other avenues. Secondly, I think that a lot of open source projects and companies look at the Black Lives Matter movement and feel very overwhelmed because it's such a big, heavy thing, and there's so much work that needs to be done. And what we encourage at GitLab is for everyone to at GitLab, we think of it as what is the minimum viable change that we can make, and what's the smallest possible thing we can do, and start iterating on that. And that's really actually that's one of the things that we've done. I know we're going to get a chance to talk about the last mile here, but it's a really good example of someone in our company, a sales development representative, had an idea, and she was really concerned about in our underrepresented communities, the school to prison pipeline in communities that are underserved, and what we as a company could do about that. So she put a coffee chat on our CEO's calendar, and we all had a coffee chat about what were some ideas. And the CEO said, "What's the smallest thing we can do?" And he said, "Well, let's call a prison and ask them what we can do." And he found the last mile, which is a program, a training program for people who are incarcerated to start learning tech, so that when they leave, they have career opportunities. And he got on the phone with them and it turned out they were using GitLab, and we didn't know. And so then we started this partnership with them, and now we're mentoring them and recruiting. We're actually giving presentations and demonstrations inside of their program to the people who are incarcerated. So I think with open source, it's all about making that smallest possible change to get started, and particularly removing the barrier to entry to start, and making it easy for people to contribute is one of those things.
And asking people what they need. That's the best way to serve people, is asking what they need instead of making an assumption and resting it upon them. May I ask a little bit more about the Last Mile program organization?
Sure.
Are there a lot of computers in, I guess this is an American?
It is in the United States. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And are there a lot of computers in American prisons? They seem much more hardcore than other countries. So
they do have computer labs that are specifically set up to be able to instruct. So there's a variety of programs that allow people to learn different things while they're incarcerated. And so many of them do actually have computer labs for learning different things. And the Last Mile is just happening to use some of those computer labs for their programs.
And it's a good way to actually test a product or an open source product on different constraints that might be in a jail, might be in a developing country, different internet connections, to understand different users and use cases. That's an easy way to sadly get a lot of people that maybe are not online yet introduced to the internet and how they are using your product.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also when we were meeting with the classrooms, one of the biggest questions they had is here I am, I'm incarcerated and I'm in this class, but to go out and actually get a job, I need experience, right? That's the thing. Everyone, you always need some kind of experience. And for people who are in higher education or very well-served populations, what do they have, right? They have connections to be able to get, meet people and get an internship. They have connections to maybe do an apprenticeship or a mentorship, or they have connections and money to go to conferences. And so these are things that whether you're incarcerated or maybe you're in underserved populations that you may not have access to, right? So that's one of the amazing things about open source, is that it provides you that opportunity. And granted, as we talked about, you may not be getting paid initially for that, but the door is open. And that's why lowering the barrier to entry is so important, because once that barrier is lowered, then people from all kinds of populations have the opportunity to, while they're learning, to be able to start gaining that experience. And so the opportunity is there. And what I think Nuritzi and I have identified is in our conversations building up to our chat today is there are some challenges, right? As you mentioned, it's predominantly male, right? You're predominantly not getting paid. So what are some things that open source projects and companies can do? And we've identified a few things that GitLab is doing, just for some practical examples. So our code contributor program has a new contributor label that we put on any issues. So issues are kind of, you can think of them as little tasks or things that need to be done. We have a new contributor label, so anyone can come in and sort by that label and find really simple fixes in our documentation, or we have a translation program, or simple UI fixes that allow them to see anyone can do this. And so that goes to show you that we are really focusing it not just on the people who are making these big contributions, but those small contributions. So our new contributor label, we have a new contributor chat in our forum that's a channel specifically for new contributors. We have merge request coaches. So if you're new, and you can reach out to someone at our company and they will walk you through it. So there's a lot of these small things that companies can do to make it easier.
Is this something you've been able to automate? Like the system knows that that's a new contributor type of request, or you are figuring out as you go? Or
so we have a program manager, Ray Paik, and he identifies contributions that are great for those first-time contributors and applies those labels as those issues are created. So there is intentionality there. We're really trying to make it easier for people, and then we can measure that, how many contributions are from new contributors.
Wow. And also, I guess you have to mark, maybe you have a new contributor who's been a long time at code and just new to your code. So you need to mark the higher level stuff as well. It gives good signals for neurodiversity, I've learned too. If you
Absolutely.
make it very clear how people can onboard, how they can be successful, it's documentation. In the end, isn't it, in code notes?
Absolutely.
Just to add to that, I think we also have this designation of weights. So you can also designate, like, is this easy or is this a difficult thing? So there's a lot of things within the product itself that can also, like, we're piloting it almost in a way for our own GitLab community. But because GitLab is a platform that enables other open source organizations to host their projects, they can use those same features to apply new contributor labels, those weights, and all those other things that are going to help newcomers enter their projects. So this is, again, kind of the beauty of working closely with our community to better understand how to make open source contributions successful for all sorts of different people. Again, you talked about neurodiversity. How do we tackle that challenge through, product features? Like, that's a really interesting challenge. And those are the things that we're really interested in digging into is, again, how do we make it easier for people to contribute to open source?
And I have to ask the final question that I ask at the end of each of my episodes of the New Stack Makers. What is one thing listeners can do to help someone else get a leg up in the tech industry? Why don't you go first, Nuritzi?
Okay, I've talked about this a lot, but really being a mentor, I think that that's really important and a skill that we need to develop, having so many newcomers coming in. So signaling it wherever you can on your LinkedIn profile, if you can, like open for mentorship or, eager to connect with others, just somehow signaling to others that you are ready to connect with them. Other things like adding what languages you speak might help, or again, what your background is might help it be a little bit easier for people to approach you. So I would say really focus on making yourself a great mentor.
I have to say, I tout myself a LinkedIn guru, and I know how to select the open to mentoring part. But as someone on a search stance, I don't know how to teach someone else how to find a mentor via LinkedIn. And it sounds to me like, is that a freemium tool or service? I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to look it up right after we get off.
Well, what I've been doing is I've been in my speeches really telling people to, like, now more and more organizations have a LinkedIn presence, and you can see this is why it's important, as you said, to list it as work experience so that people can find you later and say, like, these people, worked at this open source organization, and then they can poke through and look for, again, signals around, like, if you just put it in your profile, like, I'm eager to, mentor others. I need to do this too. I just need to, I've been talking about it a lot.
That's
just,
LinkedIn
asking
profiles.
people.
It's fine. You give
Yeah.
advice and then you never actually do it yourself.
But I will after
the
this.
norm.
Watch.
I will right after this call too.
Exactly.
It's very interesting. It's a true thing. How do you start a mentoring relationship then? Because you can't just say, I want to be a mentor. I am wise. Learn from
Yeah.
me.
For me, it's all like it has been in-person events. I usually, or when I give speeches, I found that a lot of women do feel comfortable coming up to me afterwards and just, asking me questions or saying that they're interested. And so that's where I take the opportunity to form these personal relationships. I give them, my Telegram handle or something else where they can talk to me in real time so that it's not just like, follow me on Twitter. I don't use Twitter that much. I guess you can do that there too, but whatever. Chat is easier for me. But I really try to make genuine connections to let them know to make them feel comfortable and let them know that I'm not going to judge where they are within their open source. I explain things like sustainability. I try not to assume that everybody knows what that is and really take that perspective of, like, you could be completely new to this. And I remember how I felt in that. So I'm going to do my best to act as your guide and really tell you, like, that person does this, that person does that. In order to, make a proposal, you'll need to follow this process. And so to really go beyond just the documentation, like what they would learn in documentation, and by showing the people aspect. And that's why I also think that more psychologists should be part of open source communities. Yep.
I hear that a lot with
opportunity.
the agile coaches or one of those in-demand roles in the open source community
Yeah.
that people just think it needs to be tech or translation a bit, documentation a bit, but mainly tech, people think.
Yeah.
I think also the question we talked about before, what do you need? It's a good question to start a mentoring relationship. And it may not work, but I think your reminder that before you enter open source, warning, you could burn out, is a very important thing, because when you volunteer in person, you usually have specific hours when you're volunteering at a soup kitchen. They don't want you chilling all day. But if you're in an online community, you can definitely reach burnout. So Christina, what's your answer? What is one thing our listeners can do to help someone get a leg up in the tech industry?
I would absolutely agree that mentorship is key, is one of the primary things. So that was definitely my primary answer. But I would say secondary to that is when you have those conversations and ask people and ask them, what they need, where they're at, where they're looking to go. I think really having frank and honest, challenging conversations about that. So I've said to people who say, oh, I want to be a university professor. Okay, well, let's talk about what 10 years of graduate school looks like, and then what it really means to have publishing pressure and grant pressure, and what the lifestyle looks like, and really help them understand this is the reality of the situation. This is the opportunity. And then if I don't have that expertise, being open to connect them with people in your network. So I would say taking it a step further and be open to connecting people at other companies. So some of my alumni, they've said, well, I really want to start working in this area. And then I would look at my LinkedIn connections and say, okay, well, I think this person that I know has that same solutions architect role, for example, because solutions architects are a really cool, really great position where you have technical applied knowledge, but you're not necessarily an expert developer. And so it's a great kind of in between for someone who's good at communicating, like has some technical depth, but then isn't necessarily a strong developer. So that's an example. So I've connected with someone in my profile who works at a similar company who has that role. So I think helping people make those additional second level connections, right? Because when you get a new position or you're entering the market, it's usually that second or third level connection, not necessarily that first level connection that helps you get in the door.
Help people make connections.
Yes.
It's one of the most important things. And it's the easiest, lowest bar to do is make an introduction to someone you know. I thank you both so much for spending this time with me and wish you luck in all your efforts to make open source more inclusive, more welcoming to everyone. This is Jennifer Riggins on the New Stack Makers, talking to Christina Hupy and Nuritzi Sanchez of GitLab. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD, monitoring, and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds.